Church, thank you for joining us for our daily Devo. Today, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and Paul is talking about his apostleship, but I want to skip down to verses 19 through 23, when Paul talks about a principle that's been called contextualization. And that is where you're able to take the gospel and put in a context that the people you're sharing it with can understand it. See, there's a problem. So many times, our belief in God, our relationship with Christ can be tied into who we are, into the culture we live. Therefore, it's hard to reach those outside the culture. We saw that in the first century where there was a real question, could you be a Christian without first becoming a Jew? And of course, we know in Acts that was answered, yes, you can go straight to Christ, you have to become a Jew. But Paul talks about here his desire to contextualize the gospel, not compromise, but contextualize the gospel so that those hearing it could understand it, and the lifestyle, how he lived, what he did wouldn't offend those, and they not truly hear the gospel. So he says, to the Jew, I became a Jew. In other words, when Paul was sharing Christ with the Jews, he could go to the Old Testament. He could share about Christ being the Messiah, fulfilling scriptures. He could really unpack it from a Jewish point of view. But when he was with the Greek, when he was with the Gentile, there was no reason to do that. A matter of fact, he even lived differently in a way in which he said, to the free man, I'm a free. I live the same. He said, I've become all things to all people that I might reach some with the gospel. And that becomes a very important principle. See, sometimes the gospel gets tied to a culture, a time, and therefore it becomes hard to understand. A great example of this is in history, a missionology. William Carey, when he became a missionary in China, all the missionaries communicated everything Western. They dressed Western, they ate Western, they lived Western. And when they won someone to Christ, they basically made that Chinese Christian become Western in all his attire. And that's what you become as a Christian. And that hit William Carey. One, it wasn't effective. And second, he realized, why were you doing that? So he really did something that shocked all the missionaries in that day. He started dressing like a Chinese. He started eating like the Chinese. He started hanging out with the Chinese. And when someone became a Christian, he let them stay Chinese. So having Christian songs in Chinese would be okay. All these things became okay because he contextualized the gospel in Chinese so the Chinese could understand it, and they could respond. I remember growing up in the time that they called worship wars, when all you had at a church was a piano and an organ. And all of a sudden the Jesus movement came and there was contemporary Christian music. And the question was, could you have a guitar in church? Could you share? Could you have some? It doesn't have to be a hymn that's 200 years old. No, you could do this. And so that became, could you contextualize the gospel? And guess what? They found out that churches did that let people experience worship in the style they were used to, were doing a better job of attracting those who didn't know Christ. They didn't have to go through a time warp in order to respond. And again, I like the example. It's kind of like a gas can. You can go back to the 1960s or even 70s. There's these heavy metal gas cans, and they rust. And they're just, they're hard to carry. Well, guess what? The modern gas cans we have here are made of a plastic. They're much lighter. They last longer. But what's the purpose of a gas can? The purpose of the gas can hasn't changed. It's to contain the gas. So whatever we do, our purpose is to contain the gospel, but make sure the gospel doesn't get wrapped up in the container. Paul did this, and it was so important. And Paul was so effective in taking the gospel around the world, to take it to Gentiles, because he was purposeful to become all things to all men, that he might win some to Christ. And guys, for us, are we making sure that as we share the gospel, we do it in a way in which they see it's timeless? It's not wrapped to a culture. It's unique. And we want to make sure never to compromise our values, compromise what we believe, but bring it in a culture in which the people around us can understand it and they can respond to it. And that's the key. Guys, thank you so much for being part of our daily Devo. I'm so glad you are in this journey with us, and I hope you continue.